Washington State ranks among the bottom for states that provide legislative oversight of executive emergency powers. What's Washington doing wrong? In an emergency, governors need broad powers to act fast. Legislative bodies inevitably take longer to assemble and act than a single executive, so they temporarily delegate their power to the executive in emergencies. But these powers are supposed to be transferred for a limited period of time. For example, in Wisconsin, a state of emergency cannot exceed 60 days unless it is extended by a joint resolution of the legislature. And in Minnesota, a governor must call a special session if a peacetime emergency lasts longer than 30 days. When situations last for extended periods, longer-term policies need to be implemented, and the legislature needs to debate risks, benefits, and trade-offs of various approaches. They may end up passing the very policies the governor would prefer to see implemented, but they do it after deliberation as representatives of the people and do it in a public process. It's the legislature, not the governor, that is in charge of making law, and the governor who is charged with implementing the laws passed by the legislature. Yet, Washington State ranks among the bottom for states that provide legislative oversight of executive emergency powers. Why? The state bestows upon the governor the sole authority to determine when and where an emergency exists and when it ceases to exist. It's hard to get the consent of the governed when the executive has become inaccessible. In response to the pandemic, Washington allowed public construction during early restrictions but prohibited private construction. It allowed childcare centers to open but closed schools. It deemed big box stores as essential and kept them open while small businesses were ordered closed. Had the legislature been involved in creating policy, it's doubtful we would have seen these and other seemingly arbitrary policies, and unlikely we would have been the 48th state to reopen. Whether 14, 30, 45, or 60 days, at some point the executive branch should be required to receive permission from the legislative branch to continue making far-reaching policies under an emergency order. No matter how much you might agree with a governor, our system is not meant to be the arbitrary rule of one.
Great, thank you, Chris, for playing that for us. So that, in a nutshell, is what we have been facing and what we are advocating for reform. And to help us get into this discussion a little bit deeper, we've got a panel today with two lawmakers and an author of the national study that shows how out of whack, if you will, Washington is when it comes to providing legislative oversight for emergency powers. And to start us off, I'd like to bring on Nick Murray from the Maine Policy Institute, who was the author of that national study. And Nick, I'd like you, if you can, walk us through what you've been doing, what you're seeing across the country, and why Washington's kind of a little bit different than the rest of us, the country.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks everyone for watching. I appreciate the invitation by Washington Policy Center to join you. So I'm Nick Murray. I'm a policy analyst with Maine Policy Institute. We're a small nonprofit that does public policy here up in the Northeast in the state of Maine. Last year, based on similar questions that you had, Jason, my team and we were thinking about, how does Maine stack up in the country based on legislative oversight, like your video so succinctly showed. It's really about looking at what point does the state get back to normal governance from declaring a state of emergency? And that's what we decided to look at. How does the legislature counterbalance the executive in those times of emergencies? Different states craft their laws differently. And so to sort of get the perspective down here, I broke out different, all 50 states' laws on a 5 criteria rubric. That's how emergencies are declared, how they're terminated, the time limit for each extension, whether those powers for the executive continue after the termination of a state of emergency, and whether the powers of the governor allow him or her to alter statute or regulation during an emergency. And so, as you mentioned in the video, Washington scores among the worst states precisely because the governor is the sole arbiter of whether an emergency exists and when it doesn't exist. And as far as I understand, you all are still in a state of emergency coming up on 2 years here, where most of the states in the country have at least lapsed or have gone back to normal governance. But that's really what we wanted to look at, is how does every state balance its power between the legislature and the executive in those times of emergencies, and how do we stack up versus our neighbors? How do your neighbors stack up in the Northwest? And just to sort of frame this conversation, get some ideas down about how we can maybe get back to a more balanced approach. And I'm glad to go into those, our sort of ideal policy recommendations that we've developed with you guys, Jason, and with the Pacific Legal Foundation.
Yeah, that would be great, Nick, if you would kind of lay out for us. You've already established how Washington was one of the fourth lowest ranking as far as a role for the legislature when an emergency is declared and ongoing. But if you could, along with some of those best practices, even though other states already had legislative oversight, we did see a lot of activity in this past years of them trying to gain more control. And even among the states that we were tied with, I'm thinking of Hawaii in particular, what are you seeing now happening in Hawaii as they start the new year?
Well, as far as I know, I haven't seen Hawaii's bill them change their laws. I was watching the states around the country, whether they changed their laws or not. We identified about 15 or 16 that did so, but So we released this scorecard about this time last year. I'm working on the second edition and reviewing those states that have changed their laws, and really finding that in terms of what I'm looking for here, based on the legislative oversight measure, really only 11 states substantively changed their laws, meaningfully changed their laws. And just thinking of the states that that Washington sort of hangs around with down at the bottom there, Ohio was one of those. And Ohio changed their law to significantly allow for more legislative oversight this year. So I envision their score rising quite a bit. The legislature is now able to terminate an emergency as long as it's longer than 30 days. That's kind of contrasted to a limit of zero, of none, essentially. There was no limit on a state of emergency. The governor was the only one that could declare it. So at least the legislature has some oversight on how long a state of emergency exists. The legislature in Ohio can also rescind in whole or in part health department actions on preventing contagious disease. So they have a little bit more specific oversight on executive orders. But to get to those sort of ideal policies that we've settled on and we've been talking about a lot over the last year or two, especially your work on the Olympia Watch Twitter account, Jason. So on the legislative side, like we're saying, we want oversight. So require that legislative opt-in versus an opt-out to approve to extend a state of emergency after about 2 weeks. A state of emergency that lasts 2 weeks to 4 weeks can be a considerable amount of time to be out of that normal governance structure. And so what we're saying is, have that legislative opt-in, where after those 2 weeks, the legislators have to come back. They have to vote on a resolution to continue without a majority vote. That state of emergency cannot continue. It requires the governor to come back, bring the legislators back for a seat at the table and have a balanced discussion about how to govern in the future. And on top of that, we think the legislature should be allowed to nullify or amend those particular orders from the governor, not just the state of emergency as a whole. So I think that's an important thing. There are some states that have enabled that as of last year as well, which is great to see. On the executive side, all of these orders that are going to restrict liberty and emergency, those should really be issued by one person, that's the governor, so that it provides an easy pathway to challenging that. And that sort of goes into our other side of it, is this judicial side, where the judiciary should have a clear, strict scrutiny standard by which to measure challenges to these emergency orders. In a lot of cases, courts give deference to legislature and giving deference to an executive acting in an emergency. And we believe that the court should be there to be the bulwark for liberty, and the law and the legislature can do a lot to set out that standard by which the judiciary is going to measure those challenges. In addition to these other things, there should be some automatic sunset provisions for these orders. Some states are doing that as well, whether it's 2 weeks, 30 days if they're not ratified. And just to establish that these the governor cannot be reissuing the same order or the same declaration based on similar circumstances if the legislature has denied an extension for them. So it's really about balancing the power of the executive and the legislature. And as I mentioned, outside of that immediate emergency period, we should get back to some sort of semblance of regular governance, because that's how our system was set up. No one is arguing for zero emergency powers, and no one is arguing for the executive to have no leverage in that situation. But after a reasonable time frame, the legislature should be back at the table.
Great, thanks. Sorry for putting you on the spot about Hawaii. The Hawaiian Speaker of the House basically said, we're a legislation should have a role. So he has actually dropped a bill for this session to allow the Hawaii legislature to end not only portions of an emergency order, but perhaps the entire order. And that kind of leads to another question that I had for you. When you live in a state, it kind of becomes an echo chamber. You don't really get a feel for what's happening across the country. And a lot of the narrative in Washington is this has been a partisan fight. The governor's a Democrat. It's the Republicans that are complaining. What have you been seeing nationally? Has this only been in Republican states, or have you seen any pushback in what you would call a trifecta Democratic state?
There have certainly been states where there's been substantial pushback, where the governor and the legislative majority are the same party. It's hard to point to a state where, say, Democrats controlled all three, both houses and the executive branch, and passed a reform this year. I think we're still waiting to see how that shakes out. I think here in the state of Maine, a lot of the governor's majority party allies didn't want to necessarily go and question her moves just yet. So we might see some movement this session. I'm glad to hear that Hawaii is making moves. We did hear from representatives, Democratic representatives in Massachusetts and New York, and other states like New Mexico, which push back against governors in their party. Granted, the governor of Massachusetts is a Republican, but it's we think of governors in different ways here in New England. They sort of carve out their own niche. But it is interesting to see those majority party legislators come back and oppose their own party's view of this. That to me is somewhat encouraging. But we'll wait to see how the other trifecta states sort of manage this. The one state that I would point to last year that I think made one of the most impactful changes was via ballot initiative, and that was in Pennsylvania. Obviously, that was a unique case. The governor has a very antagonistic relationship with the legislative majority. It was similar in Wisconsin, but the public backlash really pushed that ballot initiative forward and made very meaningful changes to their emergency powers law.
Great, thank you, Nick. And we're going to bring Nick back on for our Q&A with the audience here at the very end. And to that point, if you do have questions, be sure to put it into the Q&A box there. And, I opened this up by talking about governance. And from our standpoint at the Policy Center, it's not a partisan issue. It's an institutional issue. You have three branches of government for a reason, and they have unique roles. And to talk about those roles and why we still need a legislature, we're going to start bringing in our lawmaker panelists, and we'll start with Senator Lynda Wilson, a Republican, who has had a bipartisan bill proposed. And while the committee it was referred to had time to debate the state dinosaur last year, and it looks like making pickleball the official state sport this year, are we going to get a chance to see your bill move at all, Senator?
Well, that's the hope. I saw that the same as you did, that they have the pickleball scheduled. Brand new bill, by the way. So my bill's been on the books for, the entire before the last session started, because we dropped it early. So I don't know. I'm hoping that we will have the opportunity to at least have the discussion. I do know that I've been hearing from other legislators. They're frustrated as well. It is a bipartisan issue. It's just whether there's the political will to make some changes.
Senator, could you talk a little bit about what your bill would do? We heard from Nick about what he's seeing across the country. How would your bill change the current statute? And maybe for some background, what is the current statute? Why isn't there legislative oversight?
Okay, so the current statute, so basically my bill, well, what it does is, it doesn't require a special session, which is a very nice thing. The legislature would have the ability to review any emergency order. And whether it be a suspension order or a prohibition order. Right now, any order that relates to statutes or the law can be suspended, and he can do that. And we have the ability to come to the table. Mostly it's the four corners way of doing things. So there's 4 ways or 3 ways to actually address that in the four corners situation. So they agree with the proposal and extend it for a certain time, or just one caucus leader, only one caucus leader could say no, and then the order expires, or the leaders can give input and negotiate, which happened several times. And then, but all 4 corners have to agree to this particular proclamation in order for it to continue. What I would like to do is basically compare that and harmonize that process with all orders, prohibitionary and all. So the prohibitionary ones are the ones that, the lockdowns, the closing of the schools, the determining of essential people and businesses and that kind of thing. Those are prohibitionary. We would like a say of those at the table. We would like to be at the table, because you're right, Jason. I feel entirely irrelevant, and my constituents understand that. It's frustrating.
So, Senator, in the worst case scenario, if we go through this short legislative session again without your bill or a similar bill in the Senate being given a hearing, what options are available? Because these are bipartisan bills. They do have sponsors from both parties. Is there a way to circumvent the committees to bring a bill to the floor?
Well, there's always the 9th order, but they usually get around that. And we tried that last year with a couple of bills, and it didn't come to fruition. What we could have done through this entire thing is had special session. So the governor can call us back, and we knew that he probably wouldn't, but we can also call ourselves back. And it's never been done in the history of the state, but it is possible. But we needed 2/3 of the legislature to do that. And again, no political will from the Democrat side. We have to have them involved to call ourselves back into special session. But even then, if we pass it, or we try to pass a bill, or we present a bill, unless they're on board, we won't get anywhere. That's what's the frustrating part about this whole thing, is that it's very hard to move the ball.
Senator, you mentioned how under the current process, what you said, the 4 corners, which is the majority and minority leaders in the House and the Senate, can sign off on some of the regulations the governor issues, but not all. And the ones that haven't come to the legislature's 4 corners are things like closing the businesses, closing the schools, the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates. So it seems like there's a pretty big loophole that you're trying to close. But to that 4 corners question, we've heard from the governor that he has consulted the legislature throughout this 2 years as he's been issuing these orders. Have you, as lawmakers, been involved in these conversations?
No, we have not. In the first year, we sent over at least 25 letters to the governor, because that seemed to be the only way that we had any voice at all, was sending over the letters. And, based on many different things. One of the first letters I sent over was when the governor shut down all building construction across the state. For some reason, public building was allowed, but private industry was not allowed, and which was kind of odd, because I really feel like we were swinging the same hammers, right? But so we wrote to the governor and said, please, we try to make the case of why we should be why should construction be open as well. And we heard nothing. There was no responses back. I think we got response back to one letter in all of the letters that the Republican caucus sent over to them.
So having now been in this for 2 years, and with the hope that your bill will move this year, from your standpoint and from your co-sponsor standpoint, if you feel comfortable speaking for them, why does this matter? What is the most important reason why we should see emergency powers reform? What is the problem that we're trying to address if the governor says everything is working fine?
Well, and the governor has said that, and he has said that he didn't think we needed to be at the table because he needed to do this quickly. The fact is, we can do this quickly. we can, because of the way that we've been set up remotely now, we can gather ourselves. We don't all have to run to Olympia. We can all do this like we're doing this right now. So the important thing is that why is there a legislature if all we need is one person to run the state? And that's been the most frustrating part of it all. We have been elected as to represent our constituents, and we are not allowed to represent our constituents here. And you know, our Constitution, as you said in that wonderful video that you guys did, I've shared that quite a few times, that it is the legislature that's supposed to make the laws, and the executive branch is the branch that is supposed to enforce them, except for he's doing both. And so there are no checks and balances here. Which is very concerning for the state going forward. It doesn't really matter who's governor. We just know, we've recognized here that there are issues and we need to fix these now while we're in the middle of this, so that we remember what's going on. The powers that he has right now came forth in 1969 in a bill that they passed back then. And so those are the ones that are giving him all the power that he's using now. In 2019, we passed a bill, which was interesting because it was almost unanimous vote that actually put the restraints on the statutory powers or the proclamations that he's doing. Those are the ones that gave us the four corners ability to at least react and have our opinions at that point. But you know, beyond that, that's why we need it. We've got to come back to the table. It's constitutional here. Our government was not set up to run this way.
So what can those watching this or seeing this on replay, and those that are concerned about this, what can they do to help try to get your proposals or any of these proposals moving through the legislature? What should citizens be doing? Well,
we've got contacting, you know, you can contact us all day long, the Republican caucus, but we're on board with this. We need the Democrats to come on board. And I really appreciate that Mike is here today because, and my bill, like you said, is a bipartisan bill. It's Senator Mullet signed on to that. But that's really what we need to do. We have to put pressure on the Democratic caucus and the governor's office, even though right now, quite frankly, the only way we can change this is if the Democrat caucus comes together and agrees to do something and make some changes. Governor can't do anything like that, although he could say, I'm going to end the emergency now and turn it back over to the legislature. He could do that. So we can put pressure on him to do that.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator Wilson. We'll bring you back for the Q&A.
Right.
And you introduced partly our final panelist here, Democratic Representative Mike Chapman, who has had a bill both last session, a bipartisan bill, but I think you've got, with respect to Senator Wilson, my new favorite bill that maybe you introduced today just for the panel. And if you have a chance, we can talk a little bit about what you've done last session, your new bill, and the prospects for potentially this moving.
Thanks, Jason. Really appreciate the invite. I appear to be becoming the House Democrat expert on this issue. Been invited to a couple of these already. Certainly introduced co-sponsored bipartisan legislation last session. I just co-sponsored a piece of legislation with Representative Corey that we just dropped. It's already got a bill number, I think 17 something. That very similar to Senator Wilson's 60-day limit would take if the legislature's in session, would take action by the legislature. If we're not in session or not called into special session, it would take concurrence by the Four Corners leadership. And why, you know, I think there was a question on Four Corners leadership. You addressed that, but what that is really each caucus. So the House Democrats electing the speaker, the House Republicans or the minority party electing their minority leader, same on the Senate leader, Senate minority leader. But those are four individuals that really can meet with their caucus, can get a sense of where their caucus is. They probably wouldn't cast these votes without input from their members. That's not a good leadership tool. So I know at least on the House side, our speaker would meet with us if this was a piece of legislation. So all along, it would just allow legislators to have input on kind of where we're going. I would like to just take one step back and, this is not an issue for me. It's just been kind of pointed like, wow, dude, you're picking a fight with Governor Inslee. Actually, I'm not picking a fight with anybody. This has nothing to do with the current governor for me. This has everything to do with my hardcore fundamental belief in separation of powers, 3 co-equal branches of government, and the role of the legislature through whatever emergencies come our way. We really kind of appear to have a very popular governor in this state. And the reason I can say that is that very few members of his own party will actually ever step forward and say anything negative. And usually when a chief executive is unpopular in his own party, I used to be kind of a common theme. Republicans certainly criticized Ronald Reagan before the '82 elections. George H.W. Bush was criticized by Democrats before his election. Bill Clinton became criticized. I mean, when elected officials, when things are going sour, and by the end, even George W. Bush was roundly being criticized by many Republicans. That's really, so you can kind of tell that right now the public's with the governor. So this isn't a Mike versus the governor. I have no reason to pick a fight with him. This is about a fundamental process of separation of powers. I would say I don't see any hope that these bills will pass this session. I see no movement among my colleagues who want to check the governor's power. I think they think he's doing a great job, and I think they think the public thinks he's doing a great job. So there's no, and then at the end of the day, would he sign such a piece of legislation? I kind of doubt it. So then we'd have to go through a veto. So I just don't think it's going to happen. I actually think none of this, I think the public, and I say this as a Democrat, but I think the public's going to have to speak next November. And I realize, my head's on the chopping block on this one. But if you want to check power, you got to get different leaders who will make some changes. And I think, I'm just being frank. This isn't about me or the governor. This is about pure what the public wants. And if the governor's popular, people will keep things the way they are. And if he's unpopular, one thing I know, the American people will always make a change if they're not happy how things are being governed. So this is a huge mistake for my caucus, my opinion. I'm not a leader. I chair a small committee that doesn't deal with these issues, but I really do think, it's going to be, you're putting some of us at peril. But the public will decide. The public in November, I actually think in Washington State in November, the election will be decided over Governor Inslee's governance of the state with limited by himself versus do we want a legislature to, will there be a check and balance going forward in Washington State? I actually think that's the number one issue we'll be facing. I think COVID and the economy and some of these other things are going to kind of solve itself out. And I think nationally, it'll be the same thing with President Biden. Do you like the direction this country is going, or do you want to check and balance? Look, the reality is in midterms, the American people almost always make a check and balance. So that's what we're facing. And I think until that happens, it's status quo with what many of my colleagues believe is an incredibly popular governor, and that he's done a somewhat perfect job managing this pandemic. So those are my thoughts. Probably not what you normally hear from a politician, but somewhat beginning to write my own obituary, quite frankly. I think these are, in my district, he's not popular. These are not popular positions, but I'm just one person out of 98. So.
Thank you, Representative Chapman, for the very frank forecast of the bill's prospects. I'm going to hold out hope. Session hasn't even started yet, that maybe we can get movement. But you mentioned something that, admittedly, I am a governance nerd. I think about things, about the roles of the branches, the structures, the checks and the balances. And the disconnect I've been having was something that you alluded to, is that the governor's policies are popular or appear to be popular. But that seems to be irrelevant to the legislative role in this. And I'm thinking of the fact that the legislature just filed 2 lawsuits against the governors for arguably unconstitutional vetoes in some of the climate bills, something that the majority caucuses agrees with the policies, but is fighting for the role of the institution of the legislature. Why is there the seeming disconnect that even if you agree with these policies, and the reality is if they came to the legislature, many of them would probably be ratified or affirmed, Why not that desire for the legislature to have its role in this debate?
I don't know. I do believe if you could talk to, if it was reversed and then we had a Republican governor was in Washington and they were putting in policies that my caucus didn't agree with, I guarantee you this piece of legislation would pass. So I think we're in a role. I think we're in a time where it's almost damn near impossible to criticize the chief executive of your own party. And it's really kind of political suicide. So I just think it's just difficult. The two lawsuits are really technical and kind of making sure that the executive branch doesn't get into the line item veto part of legislation. But I don't think, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm among members of my caucus for these lawsuits. It's more of an annoyance and more of a, yeah, we probably have to do that. But on checking governor's authority, look, politicians react to people, and if they're not hearing criticism in their districts and things are going, and the reality is most of my colleagues are going to skate by with 60, 70, 80% of the vote in their district. Criticizing the governor is not going to help them. It's just not a good move in a deep blue district. It really isn't. I'll give credit to him. He's really popular in a lot of the state, not probably in some of the districts that people are from today, but certainly in the I-5 corridor. That's why you're not getting someone here from Bellevue or Renton or West Seattle on these panels. It's not in their best interest, nor does their district think they should criticize the governor for anything or check any of his powers. I've asked many of my colleagues, what are you going to do down the road when there's a different, if you think that Governor Inslee is doing a great job and you think he's going to be there forever and we don't have term limits, so there is a possibility that he could be elected in 2024 and 2028. But what if there's a governor, Democrat, Republican, or independent, that comes in and puts in policies you don't agree? Oh, yeah, we'd have to do something. The reality, though, is politically, you're not going to probably be in the majority at that point. I mean, if the state begins to shift, which it can't. People forget we've had I lived in this state. I remember Governor Spellman. I mean, people forget that we had a Republican governor. Seattle was once represented by a Republican in Congress. So politics is not it's not fixed in time. My opinion. Districts change all the time. Take the 19th legislative district, 2016, 2 Democrats won by well over 10%, and the Republican, Representative Walsh, won by 0.5%. 4 years later, the 2 Democrats got beat by 10%, and Representative Walsh won by like 18%. That's almost a 20-point swing in 4 years in a district that had voted Democrat for almost 100 years. You tell me politics is static and that that this is all going to stay the same and your districts are going to stay the same? Good luck with that theory.
So Representative Chapman, realizing that it's the chairs of the committees and the leadership will determine whether bills move and how quickly, kind of a similar question I asked Senator Wilson as far as what people could do to try to help provide some of the encouragement, because I have seen, though not in Seattle, some comments from your caucus colleagues, Representative Springer, Representative Whalen, indicating that there should be a role for the legislature here. Is your sense, without having to put all your colleagues on the spot, kind of a straw poll here, assuming all of the Republicans supported their bills and these came to the floor, is there enough support among some of your caucus members to get to that magic 50, or are we still not quite there?
Well, nothing would ever go to the floor that didn't have a majority of the caucus. So what you're asking is, out of 57 members, whatever, would we have 28 members? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to, you mentioned 2 or 3. If this was a priority, look, we did a lot of pieces of legislation last year that were high priorities for the Democrat caucus. A lot of legislation. This didn't even make it to the next step. Didn't come out of committee. So that's the answer right there. If it can't come out of it's not going to come out of a committee. It's not a priority. It's not a priority. And I understand that. People have to realize it's just not politically popular to criticize your own chief executive. It's not, for a lot of my colleagues, this is a bad move for, this does not help them in their districts. He's popular in their districts. Give him credit. He's popular in Bellevue. He's popular in Renton. He's popular in West Seattle. He's popular in North Seattle. He's done the things that they've wanted him to do, and I give a lot of credit for that.
It sounds like the takeaway here is those of us interested in this, need to make this a priority for all lawmakers, and maybe one way to do that again is to separate it out from the popularity or the policies, because this really is an institutional question. You can agree with everything the governor has done, but still should be concerned about whether or not there's a legislative role. So at this point, Dave or Chris, I know that we've got some questions going in. If you would like to address them to our three panelists, and all three of you are welcome to answer these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Jason. And again, want to thank Nick and Senator Wilson, Representative Chapman, for this particular panel. It's interesting to have this conversation and make it so that the people of the state feel like there's some hope without getting frustrated as well. And I know we have a lot of comments coming in on the Q&A. So let me get to some of them, and whoever would like to answer them, go ahead and chime in. This comes from Gerald, and it's to Nick. Nick, at one point, the Maine legislature dropped the operating rule where the majority party determines the chair of the committees. Is that still the case, and how is that brought about?
As far as I understand, that's a rule that the legislative leadership drove, and they had decided to sort of let each committee decide who would chair it. We have joint committees here, so the House and the Senate on each issue area convene together to hear bills in the same region. So I believe they still have the same thing. Yesterday they passed the same order to continue doing remote sessions and remote hearings and all of that, and that's driven by the legislative leadership, which is majority Democrat aligned with our governor. And Representative Chapman, I can't send enough praise your way, because it does take a lot of courage to stand up against your own party. We've seen very few Democrats respond to the governor here, and I can't echo enough. It shouldn't matter who the governor is. There should be a standardized process every time an emergency comes up. And if the policy isn't dealt with now while we're intentional about it and focused on it, the next emergency is too late.
Another question on the chat function here. Let's see, and I'll bring Jason and Senator Wilson in on this as well. Any indications the majority party desires to address reform? I think Representative Chapman addressed this. Last I heard, the House Speaker was not interested, as well as the Senate.
Well, Mike chimed in here. I can tell you that we have heard from Senator Billig. He has indicated that he's interested in this, but again, that might be Mike, but it probably wouldn't be the remainder of the Democrat Senate caucus. I don't see clearly already, if we have the schedule out of the committees and my bill is not on there. And so we'll continue to push. There may be a surprise at the end of session. Sometimes they hear them after a cutoff, which means we're going to hear it, but we're not going to do anything with it. So that's just kind of an appeasement. But either way, I mean, any hearing right now would be welcome, because then we could have the conversation. But I don't see it.
And Chris, I did give the Senate State Government Committee a hard time for hearing the dinosaur bill and scheduling the pickleball bill. While they haven't held a public hearing, they did actually hold a work session on emergency powers. And generally that could be a precursor to something down the road in session. So the House, Representative Chapman gave us a pretty frank lay of the land over there. But if one of these bills can move, then maybe something will happen. But again, maybe before we go to our questions, let me ask a question to Representative Chapman and Senator Wilson, because it is very likely, even if the legislature passes something, the governor will veto it. So is perhaps one way to avoid that and perhaps gain more support to do this as a referendum, have the legislature put it on the ballot.
Mhm. That would be a good idea, a referendum. And it would be a pretty bold move to have the legislature pass a bill and then have the governor of this type and then have the governor veto it. That would be a bold move, but I wouldn't put it past him. So that's a possibility. But a referendum is probably the best. I'll bet you it would move. I bet that we would, like what happened in Maine, right? The referendum would be probably our best choice. Let the people speak.
Representative Chapman, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the people are going to speak in November. I just think, like, if I was a Republican, I wouldn't want to see any reform this session. This is catnip for political operatives. Between that and police reform, I mean, in a district like mine, so quite frankly, I'm surprised that Republicans are pushing so hard because this is one of those great issues that come along every 20 or 30. This is the kind of issue that changes politics on a dime in a state. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. My prediction is so I don't see it. The bill that I co-sponsored, I wrote an email yesterday to the chair of the committee asking for a public hearing. I believe you'll have a public hearing on the bill. But I just don't think there's no interest in curbing the governor's authority. I believe that's a decision my party will regret one day. And I believe that for all of us, we'll have governors down the road who every time the federal government, and maybe Nick, every time Congress ceded authority to the president, every time it appears to me over the last whatever, the next president grabbed a little bit more of that authority, and the next president, including the current president, they continue to grab. This is an issue with the pandemic, which won't be with us forever, but the next governor is going to say, wow, look at all this authority I have. Look at all these policies I can put in place. Skip the legislature. Look at all this budget money I can, and this is a decision that my party will regret one day. That at this moment in time, we didn't stand up and say, no, that's not going to work for us. In Washington, especially, that doesn't work for us. We are, right, wrong, or indifferent, we're kind of known as working together, collective, trying to get good policy. But Nick, critique me if I'm wrong. You're the expert.
No, I think that's accurate. We have to look at history, and I think your answer speaks to the unique incentives available to politicians in the same way that they're less likely to criticize a member of their own party because of the potential short-term consequences of the upcoming election and those excuses there, but they're much less likely to look at the long-term historical impact of what's happening in an objective way because of the potential short-term consequences of looking at it objectively and saying, hey, if we cede more power to the executive, it's very rare, if ever, that power is given back to the people in the form of their legislators. So it's so important to watch history at the same time as being vigilant on what's happening day to day.
Well, Jason, go ahead, Senator Wilson.
Oh, I was just going to say, when you speak of history, I was mentioning that the powers that he's using now were created in 1969. I don't believe that in 1969 that legislature thought that it would be a pandemic that this would be used for, right? Probably a flood or an earthquake, that type of nature of a declaring an emergency, not something that a pandemic, which has gone on for 2 years with, and quite frankly, where's the emergency right now, right? I think that we can be managing this, but we can manage this throughout the legislature, like I mentioned earlier, because we are remote. We can be mostly remote this session. So there is no emergent manners that or any issues that we've, in the last year at least, that we wouldn't have been able to come to the table in a rather quick manner to address. So it isn't the emergency part of it.
That's such a fantastic point. Our legislative library was closed last year, so I've always wanted to go back and look at how the Maine legislature and the governor at that time, and I think it was 1983, was crafting our emergency law. And you're absolutely right. Usually in the law, they delineate what those disaster emergency or what can rise to the level of a disaster emergency. So it's important to look at the actual law, but also, if you can, go back into the legislative history and see where that debate was and how this arose in your state, and maybe that brings a little bit more background and how you can compare and contrast the different views. But I think that's a fantastic point. A pandemic is a very specific case, which now that we're seeing provides this opportunity for prolonged emergency management, much different than a flood or a natural event. And so that's why you see some of these states that are reforming their laws last year, they're specifying different parts of the public health response of this, where those emergency powers come through in that way, where it does demand a different balance of governance and a different response than a short-term weather event.
Right.
Jason,
Ours is not defined.
Jason has put in the chat the link to the different bills. So hopefully everyone can see those if you're interested in checking it out. More questions here from folks who are tuning in from all across the state. Should we just pass a constitutional amendment eliminating the legislative branch? What's the point? Anyone want to take that?
It's kind of happened by fiat. I mean, we are irrelevant right now. At least the Republican side, although he can make his own decisions without having the discussions with the Democrats in the legislature. I know that he has, as Jason mentioned earlier, he has referred to how he's been talking to the legislature. And if that's the case, it's only the Democrats, because we aren't at the table in any sense of the word.
Well, Representative Chapman, earlier you said you're not a leader. Well, I think I speak on behalf of everybody on the call today, saying you are a leader on this particular issue. I know you meant you're not in the leadership of your party, but I know everyone agrees that we just want to thank you for speaking out about this particular topic, because it takes a lot of courage being someone from the Democratic side and majority side of the aisle. Another question from Sulani: is anyone talking about how to define emergency to trigger an end to the declaration without the governor holding on to the decision?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that I don't. That's probably been lost. I think it's something I've been thinking about, but I think that has kind of been lost in the work that I've been working on. So I don't know, Senator, what do you think? I don't think that's been.
Well, I realize that it isn't defined, and that's the problem. But as soon as we try to start defining it and we rule out that pandemic doesn't fit, that's when we'll probably run into the brick walls, because that's what we're dealing with right now, is this pandemic emergency. So I don't see that changing either, because it would, again, limit his powers right now. And again, I agree with Mike. This is not about Governor Inslee. This is not a poke in the eye to Governor Inslee. It is about our constitutional rights and how we're supposed to be governed in the long term. Because in 100 years, we don't know who's going to be, governor. I think
this could be about Governor Johnson or Governor Smith, or who knows.
Chris, very quickly, I can jump in on that. The definitions and the powers, it's not broken, right? You don't want to get too prescriptive, because it can cause other problems. Broken is there's no role for the legislature. So I think that's why I'm having such a problem with this debate about this being about the Governor Inslee or it being about his mandates. If Senator Wilson's bill passes or Representative Chapman's bill passes, nothing the governor's done would be prohibited. Nothing would not have occurred. It's just at some point in time, the legislative branch of government gets to do its job again. That's all that this debate should be about.
I agree. Again, this is again. I know this is going to go wide and far, and this is not about the current governor. This has to do with checks and balances. I've been in public office this is my 22nd year. I've been in public service for 32. Before that, in law enforcement. I've lived my whole life with check and balances, whether in the law enforcement arena with a sergeant and a chief and city council, whether as an elected official with both the electorate and my fellow elected officials. I believe in a check and balance. I like having a check and balance in the role that I play. Again, chairing a committee, but there's a check and balance in the other committee members and the full legislature. I just can't put policy through with nobody questioning. I mean, it doesn't work that way. I think any elected official who doesn't want a check and balance is our founding father, George Washington. What did he do after the Revolutionary War? I mean, he literally walked into the Continental Congress, as it were, and handed over his commission, said, "You've gave me great authority. I'm giving it back. You don't want anybody to be unchecked." And that was one of the great examples of leadership in our time. And I think we've lost that among politicians who have risen to authority, and then this should be a bill that's sponsored by the governor's office. This should be governor's request legislation. End of story. Why are we even having this debate a year and a half into it or 2 years into it? This should be somebody that says, look, I had to take some steps, but at the end of the day, I need some help here. And I don't want to leave members like, I'm not going to list me, but I don't want to lose members next November. But the path we're on, I'm potentially putting some members at risk. I want to work with the legislature. And why is it so hard for a governor to say, I want to work with Republicans who represent 50% of the state, landmass wise, and almost 48 whatever percent of the population? Why isn't that the role of, that's what we want in leadership? It doesn't matter. And at that point, gosh, your popularity is even higher. But why only, I don't get that. I don't get leaders. I want check and balance. Every time I file my PDC report, I'm glad I have a check and balance that you all know where I get campaign contributions. You know how I'm spending it. Every time I file a claim for reimbursement, I'm glad I get public records requests, pull my emails. I mean, this keeps me in, this is a protection for me. And I think elected officials who don't want that protection, I'm suspicious. Republican, Democrat, Independent, I'm really suspicious. I don't like that. As me as a voter. And I think many of my constituents won't like it. The interesting thing is they're going to have a conundrum, truth be told, in my district. How do they put a check and balance on the governor without making some sort of change? So
we have a couple of minutes left here. One other question. If the governor can declare an emergency on a pandemic or health issue that can last forever, what stops him from declaring an emergency on climate change or on anything else for the purposes of trying to get his ideas and legislation and policies through?
Absolutely nothing.
That's right. That's right. And I worry about that coming down the pike, because so much of this has been related to public health. And so how now we've already heard about, the wildfires and how the effects of those on children, right? So, and if we're not eating enough broccoli and our, cholesterol rates are too high, it's wide open. And when is this emergency going to end? I can't tell anyone that. I have no idea. That should worry the people.
Another question here. I have a really difficult time getting in contact with state leadership after numerous calls, emails, letters without any response, even when I ask for a reply. How do we actually make contact with the leadership of our state?
Yeah, that's Jason, that's a topic for a whole nother day. And then I think a lot of that has to do with the Public Records Act. And I think I've talked with a lot of us are like just not replying right now because it just creates an enormous, I get emails in and I'm just like, so I think the give and take. Case in point, I'll have somebody email me something very personal, and the minute I reply, I'm engaging in their personal life. I don't know. I'm really frustrated by our inability. I think I'm not against Public Records Act. I just think it's a chilling effect on the give and take between elected leaders and their constituents. I think many of us are just not wanting. I get public records requests all the time for all my emails last session. And I'm like, okay, well, it's all the ones that came in. Every email I send now is so limited, less than a sentence or two, and it's just to the facts. And it's pretty frustrating, but that's just my opinion on that one. So if you're not getting, if you're not getting a reply, it could be that, could be that we get so many, there's also just you couldn't reply to them all.
Final question here from Jim. Why doesn't the legislature lay aside the politics of this and proceed based on the institutional prerogatives of the legislature? We've kind of answered this question, but maybe we can circle back to it as well.
It's we've already answered it. I don't know how else to say it differently.
Look, I think I'm just going to come back to a lot of my colleagues are in districts where this is popular. His position, where the way he's governing the state is popular, and you're not going to, you have to, I know for many people it's hard. There are representatives who represent districts who run on these issues and probably ran on the idea of supporting the governor's emergency authority. So to ask them to kind of, until the public makes a change, I don't think any of these is going to change. Sad part is you're probably going to make it, probably the public's going to make a change on the people who are kind of open-minded on this and leave we have it. Part of it is look at our districts. Even after redistricting, there's just a handful of competitive districts left in this state. And I'm going to be in one of them now, but most of them are 70% each way. So there's no, that's also a challenge. It's also frustrating. So my prediction is, the rural Democrats are endangered species. Eventually they'll be extinct, but the urban core will continue to be strongly Democrat and will continue to have just enough votes to hold a majority. I think it'll be at the chief executive's office that eventually the public might have to make a change there. But.
Well, we want to thank Representative Mike Chapman, Senator Lynda Wilson, and surprisingly, we did not get any questions about Nick Murray's bacon post or it looks like bumper sticker back behind there. So maybe next time on your bacon, you can explain that to us. Again, thank you to everyone for participating in this panel today. A really important discussion on a really important topic. And we thank Jason for putting it together and following this issue so intently. It really, really is important. Coming up next here at the Solution Summit, we will